I'm delighted that so many of you have turned up to listen to my wackiest talk about what is intelligence. And the reason why I give this talk is about 2 months old, when somebody asked me to give a talk at the Rustad conference in Cambridge at Jesus College, and they said, would you talk about AI and machine learning? And because I've been interested in the subject for a little while, because I did my PhD in physics at Cambridge. But towards the end of my PhD, I got so excited about AI because we had a little AI group in King's College, because it's the college of Alan Turing, and we've always had a very close relationship with AI. And there was a guy who was working on chess programs. And he managed to convince us that we're going to write this chess program that was going to be the world chess champion that autumn. Now, it took another 20 years before that happened, but the enthusiasm that we had at the time for AI stayed with me for the rest of my life. And the reason why there was such a lot of enthusiasm, because at the time, it was actually clear that the basic ideas would work, but a lot of the detail took a long time to make work. And in the meantime, I have, it's really trying to be cute here. Here we go. So let's try it again. Well, didn't that old cure-all work? So, what happened, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with that, we had a lot of excitement about AI. Then we had an AI winter. Partially responsible for that was another Cambridge professor called Lighthill, who wrote the Lighthill report saying, well, this isn't really ready for prime time. And of course, he was right. It wasn't ready for prime time. Then it got a little bit better. Then it got worse again. And then really a few years ago, it became clear that all the work that has been done on AI has been so fundamental, and all the ideas have actually been right, that there was one missing ingredient, which really was massive amounts of high quality data. So when I organized a seminar on machine learning at the Royal Society about a year ago, we got Jeff Hinton to give the keynote, and he analyzed why AI finally works, and he gave 3 reasons. The reason number one, in ascending order of importance. Reason number one, we've got a lot more compute power, which is handy. Reason 2, the algorithms got a bit better, which is also useful. But the thing that really made it work was, in his case, he showed that object recognition is now better than human. In his case, it was 15 million annotated pictures. And we're very good at recognizing faces, for example. But at 15 million, you just have to throw up your hands and say, no can do. So now the question, which is, of course, an old question, that's why artificial intelligence is called artificial intelligence, is what is intelligence? So when they asked me to give this talk at the Rustad conference, Andrew Briggs, who invited me, said, well, you know that you'll have to define what intelligence is. So I said, thanks, Andrew, this is going to be a bit of a problem. And then I found one. And what I found is knowing what to do next. And I found it from the roboticists. So there is actually a candidate answer, and I'll try to convince you in the next sort of 30 minutes that this is not as stupid as it sounds, or not as wacky as maybe it sounds. So the content of the talk is why is knowing what to do next a good characterization of intelligence. Then we'll start with plants. There's a plant called Heliotropium that has a small amount of intelligence by this definition. Then we go on to the monkeys. They have a lot more intelligence because they know a lot more and they can do a lot more. Then we go on to human intelligence. And then, of course, the big question is, will we have superhuman intelligence? And then I'll talk a little bit about the state of AI and machine learning. So why is this idea of knowing what to do next an interesting characterization of intelligence? Well, roboticists have this problem. They have a robot, and the robot is in a particular state. And what are we going to do next? You know, the robot has to decide what to do next. And in order to decide what to do next, it really has to do lots of clever things. Because the first thing it has to have in order to make this decision is it has to have a model of the world. It needs to have some idea of the world that it lives in and it acts in. So that's why the knowing is in the definition. The second thing it has to do, now that it knows the world, it actually has to do something. And people often forget, you know, when you talk about intelligence in the abstract, maybe it's just, people are just very intelligent because they know a lot or something. But intelligence isn't static. I think a key part of intelligence is actually the doing. Whether the doing is something physical or the doing is to produce sentences that you know, say something, there is always a doing associated with it. And that means a skill set. So back to the robots, for example, there are a certain number of things that robots can do. The car robots, you know, they can do the welding. There's a lot of excitement in Japan about robots that help elderly people, and you now see robots that can actually lift elderly people out of their seats and get them going. If I have enough time, I'll tell you an anecdote about the oldest fellow of St. John's College who asked me to get him going. Well, I'll tell you. So I had this lovely discussion with this oldest fellow in St. John's College, and we had coffee after the dinner, and he told me that he was the only person on the only expedition to the Antarctic between the two wars. And it was a very interesting conversation as you have with these older people. And then at the end of it, he said, "Oh, I wonder if you could get me going." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" So the room that we were in is the longest room in Cambridge. It's actually the room where Eisenhower decided on D-Day, because it was the only room that was big enough for the Normandy coast to be there, a model of that. So this is really, really young. What he meant is I sort of helped him out of the chair and got him going. I sort of pushed him in the right direction. And so he aimed for the door at the other end. And then I spotted this, the butler caught him. So it was very important to aim him correctly. And this all worked beautifully. But this is a slight digression. A quite tangent, a little tangent here. So what to do next? So there is an important time element in intelligence as well. So if you just look at something that humans do very intelligently, which is produce speech, it's quite incredible what we manage to do next. Because the next actually refers to the millisecond accuracy which even an Austrian manages to produce English words that some of you hopefully will understand. And that sequence of phonemes you have to produce in a split second, in milliseconds. And it is an amazing skill that we all have. So this time sequence, remember, is going to be important. Now I added with a goal, and that's really the most difficult part of the whole equation. And we'll go throughout my conversation that this is the bit that we don't know how to do very well. You know, we always have a goal in mind. I mean, we do things because we want to achieve something, but we are not very good at choosing these goals well, and we'll come on to that. So let's start with heliotropium, which is this wonderful plant that I found. And the nice thing about living in Cambridge, you know, I know lots of professors because it's this nice community of quite intelligent people, really. And if you have a question like, you know, is there any intelligence in plants, you'll get lots and lots of interesting answers. And this plant is really quite an interesting plant because it manages to turn its head, and there are quite a few of them, it's just the most primitive one. It manages to turn its head to follow the sun. And this is very useful for that plant because it gets more photon into its flowers. And the way it does it is with a very important molecule called auxin. Now, auxin seems to be responsible for all kinds of things in plants, but also mainly for growth. So if there is a lot of auxin on one side, one side of the plant grows more than the other, and hey presto, it follows the sun. So it has a bit of knowledge about the world, at least it knows about the sun. It knows that the sun moves, it follows the sun, so it knows, it has a skill, which is following the sun, albeit that's the only skill that it has in terms of movement. It responds in minutes, not very fast, but because the sun doesn't move very fast, so that's not very important. But look at the goal, and that's where we come to the big disruption when we come to humans. The goal was really, for all of these things have always been set by evolution and not by us. So this thing does what it does because it's the survival of the fittest. That's why you had Darwin in the first slide, and it just happened that way. So let's move up one. It's a bit slow. I just have to wait for long enough. Okay. Here it is, the cow. So, as you can see, it deals very well with the sun, but this poor plant does not deal very well with the cow, because plants have two problems. One is they can't see very well, and even if it did recognize the cow and realize this was bad news, it couldn't run away. It couldn't do anything about it. And that, so some of our clever professors at Cambridge tells me, is the reason why plants don't have brains. Because if the brains were eaten, the plant would be in serious trouble. Whereas if you just eat parts of the brain and you have a lot of distributed intelligence, you're much better off. But this is, of course, not the case when you go up one level from plants to animals. They can do lots of things. So the monkeys, for example, they have eyes, and now their knowledge of the world has expanded fantastically. So it knows about lions and nuts and trees and the mother and all these things that, of course, animals get to know through evolution and then through exposure to the world through their families. And they know what to do when they see a lion. But interestingly, when they see a lion, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to run. Because if a lion sleeps over there and is absolutely docile, and they've met lots of lions in this state before, they will just ignore the lions and keep feeding and doing whatever else they do. But if they see the lion sort of stalking them and moving, it realizes, well, the last time, my brother got eaten or something, and then they run for their life. So if you look at the differentiation and the model of the world that animals managed to build up over evolution, over the long periods of evolution, it is fantastically complex. So the knowledge bit has really increased fantastically. The number of responses and skills that animals develop, like eating the nuts and finding out which food is poisonous and which food is good. That also is a combination of course, evolution and learning from mothers in the family and so on. So they can run, they can climb, they can suck, they can mate, they can groom. And they do this in sophisticated sequences. But look at the goal. The goal, again, comes from evolution. It's not a goal that they can set themselves. So that was the example of the sleeping lion, and there's the one with the stalking one. So what about humans? Well, we have, of course, the same thing, even more so. We've got more memory. Now, of course, expanded enormously by Wikipedia. And things like G equals 8 pi t. My first degree was in gravitational theory. This is the theory of general relativity. G and T are actually two-dimensional tensors, so it's a little more complex than just this. But it is amazing that this simple equation contains all we know about gravitation. So it is an incredibly compact representation of everything that we know about gravitation, including the black holes, the lovely gravitational waves that have recently been discovered, etc., etc. So it is an amazing achievement of mankind, and of course there's a similar thing with Maxwell equations for electromagnetism and Schrödinger's equation for quantum mechanics. We managed to compress and abstract, really amazingly complex phenomenon into very, very simple formulas. And this allows us to have at our disposal not just the knowledge that we've gained in terms of categorizing the world that we see, but also create sort of virtual worlds through our imagination. So one of the great advantages that we have as humans is we can extrapolate from the real world, and we can dream up these stories, that of how the world might evolve. And Charlie has just told you a great story about CognitionX, how he hopes that CognitionX will evolve. And I think you all realized, well, this might actually work. This might be useful for me. You could connect with that, although it's something that's still very, very abstract. Then, of course, we've got lots more instruments than animals have. And the way we deal with these lions is we've got things called guns. Unfortunately, we practice them not always on lions, but sometimes other human beings, as we see in Syria at the moment. So we've become very, very powerful. And we've created very fancy plans. So this what to do next, where the next spans periods of time from a few milliseconds in order to produce speech or whatever else you want to do, to really a life plan where people say, well, I would like to study economics in order to build a company, or I want to study medicine in order to become a doctor. So these are very long-term plans that we've managed to put together as humans. But here comes really the most difficult problem for us, because we are the first animal in history that is beginning to define our own goals. And this is going to get a lot worse, partially because of AI, and partially because of the way we can influence our own race biologically. So I've just invested in a joint venture with Cambridge Consultants, one of our great consultancy company, and a company called Evonetics, which is doing DNA synthesis. I was encouraged to do this by the wonderful success we've had with Solexa, which is a company that we funded a few years ago, which did a new instrument for DNA sequencing. And DNA sequencing turned out to be really quite important, and this company is now responsible for 90% of all the genome sequencing in the world. It's a company we sold to Illumina for 600 million pre-revenue, so it was a very good revenue multiple. And they claim rightly that this was one of the cheapest and most successful acquisitions in biotechnology, because the part of Illumina is now worth 22 billion, but the sequencing part is 15 billion. So, and the reason for that is that this breakthrough idea has managed to reduce the cost of sequencing a human genome from $10 million to $1,000. So this is a factor of 10,000. Now, I have lived off Moore's law all my life. This is a factor of 2 every 2 years, so you get 5 of those in a decade. That's 2 to the 5th. That's a factor of 32 a decade. Here we've had a factor of 10,000 in just 7 years. I've never seen anything like this. And I don't know any parallel of that in any sector. So because of this experience with Solexa, I actually went back to our lectures in Cambridge on molecular cell biology because I thought this can't be the only one. Maybe there are a few more, and I want to be involved in that too. And what I found, and the reason why I now do more life science investments than ICT investments, is that there is a veritable tsunami of really exciting new research results just coming out of the research labs in molecular cell biology that I think will revolutionize healthcare together with big data. So in my opinion, the single biggest opportunity for all of us, because it's a very interdisciplinary problem, the biggest opportunity is healthcare. It's the only $1 trillion opportunity I've ever come across. And here is the justification for this proud number. The US spends $3 trillion on healthcare, 2/3 of which, i.e. $2 trillion, is spent on treating people who are ill. And $1 trillion, a third, is spent on diagnostics and keeping people healthy. Everybody expects this to shift to about 50-50 in the next 5 years. So that's a shift of $1 trillion. So where is that $1 trillion going to go? Well, it's going into much better diagnostics. Apple Watches, where is it here? Fitbits, 24/7 electrocardiograms, which are just appearing, all the wearable stuff. But what good is that if you can't analyze it? So I recently chaired a machine learning, another Royal Society machine learning seminar on the application of machine learning to pharma. And we had GSK and AstraZeneca and all the big pharma companies there. And they have a big problem because I think they're at a similar state of their development that IBM and AT&T was at when they closed down their big research labs. I used to pilgrim to Bell Labs at Murray Hill because that's where the smartest people in the ICT industry were. And it was inconceivable to us that anybody would ever close down Bell Labs because that's where all the clever people were coming up with all the clever new ideas. Why did AT&T do that? Well, the reason was that the way AT&T organized the exploitation of their fantastically clever R&D wasn't efficient enough in terms of taking the breakthroughs and making products out of them so that they didn't manage to reap the benefits of the research labs. And what we saw actually was people like Charlie starting new companies. So it was all the startup community that then took the clever people that were made redundant by Bell Labs and made the explosion in ICT that we've witnessed with all these new, much smaller companies. And I see a certain analogous development in the pharma industry, that a number of the big pharma companies are now shutting down their central research labs and buying up or buying in new molecules from biotech companies at earlier and earlier stages. It used to be only phase 3, it's now phase 2 and phase 1. And I think the biggest opportunity, however, will not be in drugs in the future, but will be in all the things that will keep us healthy. And the explosion in the available data that will be produced by all the wearables, I think will have probably a bigger impact on healthcare because it can feed back to the individual what they should and shouldn't do. I mean, there's this very simple, I don't know how many of you have this Apple Watch, but there's an irritating, thank you very much, little thing that tells you every hour, and now stand up. It turns out research shows that if you do stand up every hour, it has a big effect on your circulation, not surprisingly. So all the toxins that accumulate in your knee joints or wherever when you sit for too long, get circulated a little bit. So this little thing makes a big difference. And I see, I can just see that we'll have lots and lots more along those lines. So let's get on to superintelligences, because there's a lot of excitement about that. And let's start with the knowledge. Do computers know more than we do? Well, I don't think that's a tough one to get evidence for. You just look at Wikipedia. Clearly, there's a lot more information in Wikipedia than any single person could ever have. So if we think about knowledge and intelligence in general, I always think about it in two dimensions. On the x-axis, you have the number of different things that you know about, and there are lots of little skills that we are not even aware of we have, some of which are very, very difficult to reproduce by a computer, for example, like doing up a button. I can do this easily. Most of you can do this easily. You try and get a computer to do up a button. It turns out to be incredibly skillful because of the fine manipulation of the button. And when you find the hole, you've got to shove it in the right way. And we do this without thinking. Or, well, I'm not wearing shoes with laces, but doing up your laces. That's a skill. And we've got lots and lots of this skill. So if, who has heard of the Amazon Echo? Right. Did you know that the Amazon Echo now has 2,000 skills? So, what are the skills that it has? Well, they have really very primitive skills. Like a skill might be to turn on the lights. So you can say, please turn on the light, or turn up the music or something. So there is a horizontal axis of really a very large number of skills that we have. But if you look along the horizontal axis, it's also not very difficult to imagine that computers will get more intelligent than us because they'll just have more skills than us. Just look at all the welding robots, etc. They'll weld better than we will. So I don't think producing an argument that there will be a superintelligence there is very hard to make. Now let's come to the y-axis, which is really the depth of knowledge or the depth of intelligence. Now that's a little bit more challenging. But let's not forget there have already been for a very long time superintelligent computers that do arithmetic, for example. We've had calculators that would multiply two numbers faster than any human for a very long time. So this is not news. We know that computers can be superintelligent also in the depth. And in the what, there's more, there's deeper, but not necessarily smarter, because it's the combination, it's dealing with the complexity. It's the combination of a large number of skills and the depth of planning some of these skills that's the difficult bit. But here comes the sort of mathematically exciting statement about, will we have infinitely intelligent superintelligences? Well, if you go with my definition, knowing what to do next, if you always know what to do next ad infinitum, in some sense you're infinitely intelligent. And even that is not that hard, because if you think about calculating E, that's a computer who always knows how to give you the next number of E or pi, and in that sense, a computer is infinitely intelligent. But here comes the big problem with the goals. Who sets the goals for the AIs that we're going to have? And my hope here is, of course, there are lots of dystopian stories that people tell, and there are also utopian futures. But my hope and my expectation is that we're going to co-evolve with these intelligences, and that although we're very bad at choosing these goals, we will get the feedback, and hopefully the whole thing will not be will not be fast enough, too fast for us to keep up with this. So I must tell you about a book that I read as a student in Vienna called The Logical Construction of the World by Rudolf Carnap. He was one of the Vienna Circle together with Wittgenstein and lots of other clever people. And he tried to explain how we arrive at all the concepts that we use in our lives. You know, the concept of a house, or red, or big, or mother. And he amazingly could show that you can derive all the concepts in the world from a single concept called Ähnlichkeitserinnerung, which really rolls off the tongue, and sort of is freely translated as the recall of similarities. So if as a kid you can recall that something was similar to something that you've seen a little while ago, you start grouping these experiences together. And if it happens often enough, you then group it together into a ball, or your mother, or whatever it is that occurs all the time. And interestingly, it doesn't need to be the same because, of course, the eyes don't see the mother or the ball the same. The clever bit that we do is we can abstract from the different angles in which, at which we see the mother that it is the same thing because it is similar. So harnessing these analogies are very important. And there's, of course, this mapping between similarities and graphs, and maybe one of the very interesting challenges is to define a sort of a similarity function between graphs to help us with this. And just to give you a wild example that I thought of is the similarity between tennis and finance. So when you play tennis, and the guy is running to the left, of course what you want to do is play to the right so that he's got difficulty getting the ball, right? Now in finance we've got sort of similar situations where people are lemmings. They sort of all go and start investing in one area because it becomes very fashionable. And then maybe it might be a good idea to look at the areas that they've forgotten about and invest there. Now what does tennis have to do with finance? Really nothing. But it's easy for us just by telling each other the story to see the analogy. And we're very good at that, to do this really at ridiculously high levels. So here comes a sort of my main, if there is a slide that I want you to remember from my talk, this is really it. That machine learning and the whole AI is not about ones and zeros, but about probabilities. So we're so used to identify computers with zeros and ones, that we've really become seduced by the simplicity of expecting that computers can make a decision between right and wrong, and something is either correct or incorrect. And the real world, the interesting world, is not like that. The interesting world is all about probabilities, and one of the big insights of AI was, of course, to work with these probabilities very efficiently. And I'd just like to tell you an exciting but also sad story. The last conversation I've had with David Mackay, who sadly died, and is one of our great professors at Cambridge, who wrote two great books. One great book called energy or renewable energy without the hot air, or climate change without the hot air. If anybody wants to know about climate change, from really quite a fundamental physics point of view, without all the stupid arguments that exist about climate change, we can really recommend that. But the most important book that he wrote was on inference, on Bayesian inference. It's just one of those wonderful textbooks. And in a train ride from London back to Cambridge, he wanted to do an Excel spreadsheet. He wanted to do a new project where the entries in the single cells weren't numbers, but they were distributions, and use that as a decision support system for politicians who actually often can't, the decisions that politicians often have to make clearly aren't black and white. And there are all these, probabilities, and they find it very, very hard to combine these probabilities to come up with sensible solutions. So, think about probabilities rather than zeros and ones. Give up the hope of determinism. Everything really is statistical. And we're moving from programming to teaching with all the simplification of that, because if you can just train a thing up with good training data sets, that is absolutely wonderful. The problem is, because you've given up on determinism, it's a bit like with kids. If you train them to do something, they will do it, or they might decide not to do it. So there is a problem there. And of course, the enabler is to have the big, high-quality training sets. But it needs these human goals, which leads us to the genie problem, because we are very bad at wishing for the right thing. In fact, we normally get it wrong. What we normally do, and that's the big challenge for AI going forward, is we normally just try it, see what happens, and then if things go wrong, we try and fix it. And just to give you one example of how this has panned out with safety belts. We've had cars for something like 70 years before we thought, wouldn't it be a good idea, rather than killing everybody in a car, if there was a safety belt so that some people wouldn't die in cars? And I remember having this conversation with one of the brightest people who ever worked for me, a guy called Jim Mitchell, who ran my Econ Research Center in Palo Alto, then became a Sun Fellow. And I arrived in San Francisco Airport, and it was just the time when the seat belts became compulsory in the UK. I'm just showing my age here. And I asked Jim, Jim, is it the law in the US as well that you have to wear seatbelts now? And his reply was, Herman, you ought to know better. The laws of physics are the same the world over. You have all seen many of these lovely AI movies, some more dystopian than others. There is a good friend of mine called Martin Rees, who was president of the Royal Society, master of Trinity College, and astronomer royal. So if you're a gamer, you collect all the gems. He collected all the best gems that you can as an academic. And he wrote a book called Our Final Century, pointing out the problems associated with AI. And he then talked to his publisher and said, we really ought to sell this in the US as well. And he said, no, you can't sell Our Final Century. You've got to call it Our Final Hour, because Americans want instant gratification. There is another famous book called Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom in Oxford. They sometimes produce very good professors too. And another one, Murray Shanahan, called the Technological Singularity. And they really are, if you've got any interest in that area, they really are excellent books. And of course, both Steve Hawkins and Elon Musk making pronouncement on AI risks. Stephen saying, who's my neighbor in Cambridge, saying success in creating, and I gave him his first voice. It was on the BBC Micro. He said the success in creating AI would be the biggest event in human history. Unfortunately, it might also be the last, unless we learn how to avoid the risks. And Elon Musk, who is the new Steve Jobs in the Valley, said, hope we're not just the biological bootloader for digital superintelligence. Unfortunately, that is increasingly probable. And that's also why I'm supporting Martin Rees's Center for the Study of Existential Risk. So where are we on artificial intelligence? Well, of course, that we do now finally have some time a world chess champion. By the way, the thing that makes me very optimistic about our role in the future of AI and with these superintelligences is that the strongest chess player is actually not a computer program. It is a human supported by the computer program, so we still have our uses. In 2011, the IBM Watson program won Jeopardy, which was really quite an achievement. But by far the most interesting achievement in games was AlphaGo's win earlier this year in Korea against Sedol. There's our superstar here, Demis Vasabis of DeepMind. And how did they do it? Because everybody knew that the number of positions in Go is 2 to the 270, I think, which is a very large number considering that there are 2 to the 80 atoms in the universe. So there was no way in which you could have a rule-based system that could make any progress there as opposed to chess, which is really much simpler. So the only way you could do it is to mimic the way humans do it. They sort of develop a feel for what is a good move and where what you should do, and that's why there are these Go schools. They're perceived by many of the Asians as an art form rather than a game. And this is. There are 40 million people playing Go, mainly in Asia, and some sort of mathematicians and physicists. I used to play Go when I was a student. I was only a 9Q, which is the lower ranks. The higher ranks are the Dans. But it's a very sort of passionate game. It's a gentle game, but you create this passion for dominating certain parts of the board. So let me tell you the story of move 37 in game 2, I think. So there is a tradition of this scoreboard is a 19 by 19 board, and when you play on the third line, you basically tell your opponent, I really want to dominate this part out to the edge. If you play on the fourth line, you say, well, I really want to influence this area here, and I claim my stake on this area. And this move in the early parts of the game. And this move 37 in game 2 was a move on the fifth line. This was such an outrageous move that Lee Sedol got up from his chair, walked around for 15 minutes, trying to understand whether this was a bug in the program and the program had made a big mistake, or whether it was something really clever. It turned out to be the move that won the game. And it was a move, I think, up here, which finally influenced an end game down here, which won the game. Because although you can't move the stones in Go, they sometimes sort of spread their influence across the board. These moves are so important in Go schools. There are some moves that are known. There's a whole period of the game of Go that is named after certain great moves of the past. And this was one of those moves. It was like discovering a new Picasso. It was this art form. Very satisfactorily for us humans, Lee Sedol responded with one of his own great moves in game 4, and he did actually win one game out of the 5. So where are we? We've got speech recognition that's now better than human. And if we have time, I've got a little example of this with a Cambridge company called Evie. I don't know how many of you have heard this before. It was sold to Amazon and is now the software in the Amazon Echo. But this is what it can do, I hope. Who was president of the United States when Obama was a teenager? I was on mute. Okay. Hang on. Who was president of the United States when Obama was a teenager?
Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, and Gerald Ford were the US presidents when Barack Obama was a teenager.
Now, is that cool or what? So, what did it have to do? It had to recognize that Obama, of course, is a president. It had to work out what a teenager is. A teenager is only a teenager between 13 and 19, so that's only 7 years. So how can you have 4 presidents in 7 years? I thought it got it wrong. So I looked it up, and the interesting answer is that Nixon resigned 3 days after his 30th birthday. Gerald Ford only served out the Nixon term, which was 2 years. Jimmy Carter was only a one-term president, so it's another 4 years, and then Ronald Reagan, so it was actually correct. But working all that out in real time, is good progress with natural language processing. So, Cortana, Google Now, Siri are all really making good progress on speech recognition and natural language understanding. We've got encyclopedic knowledge. We've got excellent face recognition. We're about to have self-driving cars. In fact, I've been in the Google car. It is a weird experience because, we were driving down the motorway near San Jose, and we were on the overtaking lane. And there was a Mercedes car in the middle lane. And as a human, you could see the guy was really just weaving around in his lane. He wasn't really trying to go into our lane, but, he wasn't sure. So what did the car do? We were sort of overtaking. So the car did exactly what a human would do. It would slow down. It observed the guy, weaving around a little bit, and then decided, he's going to stay in his lane, and then overtook the car. And we got lots of good diagnostic programs. So we will have these superintelligences. I think in our community, you're an AI community, you know this, that I think most people now believe that they will exist before 2050, but they're almost certain by 2100. But how can we ensure that AGI, this artificial general intelligence, will embody human values? Big question, don't know, and it's a potential threat for many jobs. So in conclusion, I just want to, before we start with questions, tell you that I thought the roboticists had a very interesting definition of intelligence called knowing what to do next, that intelligence has breadth, depth, as well as complexity. There are analogies between these complexities, and maybe the analogy is like the analogy between graphs. We can transfer these skills from one domain to the other. But the biggest question that I really don't know the answer to, and the reason why I hope you will all engage in this discussion about AI, is that we don't know how to set the goals. Thank you very much.